Some love stories are meant to last forever, but Ethan Wells learned that forever can end in just 3 days. When you lose the person you thought you'd spend your life with, the questions never stop haunting you, especially when they vanish without a trace. In 2003, Ethan married Marina in a simple ceremony in Portland. They packed their old green car and headed into the Pacific Northwest for their honeymoon. On day 3, Marina disappeared from a remote forest road. No body was found. No clues were left behind. For 22 years, Ethan lived with the guilt and the whispers. Then researchers found their car deep in the woods, covered in moss and thyme. Marina's wedding ring was still on the dashboard, but it was the camera they found that changed everything. The final footage showed Marina running into the dark forest, whispering words that would shatter Ethan's world. He's not who you think he is. But what did Marina discover about her new husband that terrified her enough to run? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone rang at exactly 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the familiar quiet of Ethan Wells' small apartment above Murphy's Auto Repair. At 52, Ethan had grown accustomed to the rhythm of predictable days. Coffee at sunrise, work until dusk, and evenings spent reading in the worn leather chair that had been his grandmother's. The coastal Oregon town of Seaside had embraced him as one of their own, a steady man who fixed engines with the same gentle patience he applied to everything else in his carefully ordered life. But this call would shatter that order completely. "Mr. Wells, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the Oregon State Police. I'm calling about your wife, Marina." Ethan's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. 22 years had passed since anyone had called Marina his wife. 22 years since he'd stopped wearing his wedding ring, though he still reached for it sometimes in moments of stress or loneliness. "I'm sorry, Detective, but we found the car, Mr. Wells, your green Volkswagen Beetle." The words hit him like a physical blow. Ethan sank into his kitchen chair, the one with the wobbly leg he'd been meaning to fix for months. The green Beetle, their green Beetle. The car they'd bought together from a retired teacher in southeast Portland, pooling their meager savings because Marina had fallen in love with its cheerful color and the way the afternoon light looked through its curved windshield. Where? The word came out as barely a whisper. Deep in the Cascade National Forest, about 40 miles east of where you reported it missing. "We'd like you to come identify it officially, if you're able." Ethan closed his eyes and was suddenly 29 again, standing in the parking lot of the Multnomah County Library on a rain-soaked Thursday in February 2003. He'd been there to return a book on small engine repair. Even then, he'd been drawn to fixing things, finding comfort in problems that had clear solutions. Marina had been coming down the library steps, arms full of photography books, when the wind caught her scarf and sent it dancing across the wet pavement. He'd chased it down without thinking. This red wool scarf that smelled faintly of vanilla and darkroom chemicals. When he'd handed it back to her, she'd smiled with such genuine warmth that something tight in his chest had loosened for the first time in years. "Thank you," she'd said, wrapping the scarf around her neck with practiced efficiency. "I've had this since college. My roommate knitted it for me. I'd have been heartbroken to lose it." That's how it started, with a rescued scarf and a woman who talked about heartbreak as something temporary, something that could be mended with the right care and attention. Marina Delacroix was 26 then, a part-time librarian and aspiring photographer who lived in a studio apartment above a used bookstore. She developed her own film in the bathroom she'd converted into a makeshift darkroom, hanging her prints on a clothesline strung between the shower rod and the towel rack. Her photographs captured ordinary moments with extraordinary tenderness. Children feeding ducks at Laurelhurst Park, elderly couples sharing benches, the way early morning light fell across empty bus stops. Ethan had grown up poor, in the kind of poverty that follows you like a shadow, making you careful with words and suspicious of good fortune. His father had left when Ethan was 7, chasing promises of work in Alaska that never materialized. His mother had died 2 years later in a car accident that left him in the care of his grandmother, a woman who loved fiercely but carried sorrows she never spoke about. But Marina saw something in him that he'd never seen in himself. She saw past the second-hand clothes and the careful way he counted out exact change at restaurants. She saw the gentle hands that could coax life back into dying engines. The way he listened when people talked, really listened, as if their words mattered more than his own comfort. Their courtship unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a photograph developing in her bathroom darkroom. Coffee dates that stretched into afternoon walks. Evenings when she'd cook simple meals in her tiny kitchen while he sat at her second-hand table, watching her move with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. She was beautiful, but not in the way that made men stupid. Marina's beauty was quieter than that, the way she laughed with her whole body, the concentration on her face when she framed a photograph, the careful attention she paid to everyone around her. As if each person contained stories worth discovering, Ethan had never considered himself the marrying kind. His grandmother had raised him with love, but also with caution, reminding him that the Wells men had a history of leaving things unfinished. But Marina made him want to finish things, to build something lasting and true. The green beetle came into their lives 6 months after that first meeting. Marina had spotted it in a classified ad, parked in the driveway of a retired high school English teacher in the Hawthorne district. The woman, Mrs. Patterson, had owned the car since 1987, treating it with the meticulous care she'd once applied to teaching grammar to reluctant teenagers. "She's got personality," Marina had said, running her hand along the car's smooth curves. "Look at that color. It's like happiness made visible." Ethan had been more practical in his assessment. The engine was sound, the body mostly rust-free despite the Oregon rain. But watching Marina's face as she peered through the windows, already imagining road trips and weekend adventures, he'd found himself nodding before Mrs. Patterson had even quoted a price. They'd bought the car together, splitting the cost down the middle, though Ethan had quietly contributed more when Marina wasn't looking. She'd insisted on naming it Sage, after the particular shade of green that reminded her of the high desert country she'd grown up in eastern Oregon. "Cars need names," she'd explained seriously. "How else do they know they're loved?" The proposal came naturally, inevitably on a Saturday morning in December 2002. They'd driven Sage out to the Columbia River Gorge to photograph the winter waterfalls, and Marina had been lying on her back on a blanket, camera pointed at the grey sky, trying to capture the way the mist moved between the bare trees. "Marry me," Ethan had said. The words arriving without planning or ceremony. Marina had lowered her camera and turned to look at him. Her dark hair spread across the wool blanket like spilled coffee. "Are you asking or telling?" "Asking, hoping." "Yes," she'd said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Ethan Wells." They'd married on a Tuesday in March 2003 in a simple ceremony at the courthouse with 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway. Marina wore a vintage dress she'd found at a consignment shop, cream-colored lace that made her look like she'd stepped out of one of her own photographs. Ethan wore his best shirt and the suit jacket his grandmother had bought him for job interviews. The honeymoon had been Marina's idea. "Let's take Sage and just drive," she'd suggested. "No reservations, no schedules. Just us and the road and whatever we find." They'd planned to explore the Pacific Northwest, maybe make it up to Canada if the mood struck them. Marina had packed her cameras and enough film for a month. Excited about documenting their first adventure as husband and wife, Ethan remembered loading their suitcases into Sage's small trunk on that bright morning in June 2003. Marina had insisted on bringing a cooler full of sandwiches and her grandmother's thermos, the one with the faded flowers painted on the side. She'd been practically vibrating with excitement, taking pictures of everything, Ethan loading the car, their hands clasped on the steering wheel, the Oregon license plates that read Sage 1, because Marina had insisted on personalized plates. This is the beginning of everything," she'd said, kissing him as they pulled away from their apartment building. The first day of the rest of our lives, but the rest of their lives had lasted exactly 3 days. Detective Chen's voice brought him back to the present, to the reality of his cold coffee and the ceramic shards scattered across his kitchen floor. "Mr. Wells, are you still there?" "Yes," Ethan managed. "Yes, I'm here. I know this must be overwhelming, but we need you to come up and confirm the identification. There are some things we've found, evidence that might help us understand what happened to Marina." Evidence. After 22 years of nothing, of questions that echoed back unanswered, there was finally evidence. Ethan looked around his small apartment at the life he'd built from the pieces Marina had left behind. The walls were bare, except for one photograph, a picture Marina had taken of their hands on their wedding day, his grandmother's simple gold ring visible on his finger. He'd put away everything else, all the other photographs, all the reminders of what he'd lost. But this one had stayed, a daily reminder of the promises he'd failed to keep. "I can drive up today," he said. "Where do I need to go?" Detective Chen gave him an address and directions to a Forest Service road he'd never heard of, in a part of the Cascades he was sure they'd never visited. After she hung up, Ethan sat in his kitchen for a long time, listening to the sounds of seaside waking up around him, the coffee shop opening downstairs, the gulls calling over the harbor, the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore. He'd chosen this place deliberately, this quiet town where no one knew his story, where he could simply be Ethan the mechanic, reliable and unremarkable, where no one whispered about the husband whose wife had vanished, the man who'd somehow lost the most precious thing in his life and never found it again. Now, all of that was about to change. Whatever Detective Chen had found in that forest, whatever evidence had survived 22 years of rain and seasons and time, it was going to force him back into the story he'd been trying so hard to forget. Ethan stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 52 years in his joints and bones. He cleaned up the broken coffee mug, methodical and careful, the way his grandmother had taught him to approach any mess, one piece at a time, no rushing, no shortcuts. Then he called Murphy's Auto Repair and left a message that he'd be taking some time off for a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. Marina had been his family, brief and shining and lost. And whatever was waiting for him in that forest, whatever Detective Chen had found after all these years, it felt like the kind of emergency that changed everything. He packed a small bag with the same care he'd shown the broken mug, toothbrush, change of clothes, the photograph of their hands from the wedding day. He didn't know how long he'd be gone or what condition he'd be in when he came back. Before leaving, Ethan stood for a moment in front of the bathroom mirror, studying the face that looked back at him. Grey had crept into his brown hair, and lines had settled around his eyes and mouth, the accumulated weight of 2 decades worth of wondering and guilt and carefully managed grief. "She's coming home," he said to his reflection, testing the words, seeing if they felt true or merely hopeful. Then he locked the apartment, climbed into his pickup truck, and began the drive back into the past that had been waiting for him all along. The Forest Service road wound deeper into the Cascades than Ethan had expected, each mile taking him further from the familiar coastal landscape he'd called home for 2 decades. Detective Chen had been precise in her directions, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that waited at the end of that narrow, rutted path. The green Volkswagen Beetle sat in a natural clearing like a monument to time itself. Moss had claimed the lower half of the car, creeping up through the wheel wells and spreading across the hood in thick, verdant patches. Ferns had sprouted from cracks in the windshield, and somewhere in the intervening years, a Douglas fir sapling had taken root near the rear bumper. Now grown tall enough to shade the entire vehicle, Ethan's legs gave out. He found himself sitting heavily on a fallen log, staring at what remained of Sage, the car that had carried his dreams and his young wife into this wilderness 22 years ago. "Mr. Wells." Detective Sarah Chen approached carefully, a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. I know this is difficult. Behind her, a small team of investigators worked methodically around the vehicle, photographing every angle, cataloging every detail. Forest Service researchers in khaki uniforms consulted clipboards and pointed at various plant species that had colonized the abandoned car. "How long has it been here?" Ethan's voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty with emotion, based on the vegetation growth patterns, probably since shortly after your wife disappeared. The researchers found it last week during a botanical survey of old-growth recovery areas. This section of forest has been off-limits to the public for decades due to unstable soil conditions. Ethan forced himself to stand, to move closer to the car that had once represented freedom and possibility. The driver's side door hung open, revealing an interior transformed by nature's patient reclamation. Ferns cascaded from the dashboard, and what looked like a small ecosystem of moss and tiny wildflowers had established itself across the seat fabric. "We found personal items," Detective Chen said gently. "Things that survived the weather." She led him to a portable table where evidence bags had been arranged with careful precision. Ethan recognized Marina's camera bag immediately. The brown leather satchel she'd saved for months to buy, waterproofed and treasured. Next to it sat a thermos, still recognizable despite years of exposure, and a small pile of what looked like jewelry. "Her wedding ring," Detective Chen said, holding up a sealed evidence bag. It was on the dashboard, as if it had been placed there deliberately. The simple gold band caught the filtered forest light, unchanged by time in its protective bag. Ethan remembered sliding it onto Marina's finger at the courthouse, the way she'd twisted it nervously during their first few weeks of marriage, not yet accustomed to its weight. And this. Detective Chen lifted another evidence bag, this one containing Marina's camera. It was sealed inside a waterproof bag tucked under the passenger seat. "The film inside is intact." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. "You developed it?" "We did. Most of the shots are from your honeymoon, landscapes, pictures of you, normal vacation photos. But the last few frames..." Detective Chen paused, studying his face. "Mr. Wells, I need to ask you some questions about your wife's state of mind during that trip. Was she acting strangely? Nervous? Afraid?" "Afraid?" The word felt foreign in relation to Marina, who had faced the world with such open curiosity. "No, she was excited, happy. She'd been planning the trip for weeks." Detective Chen exchanged a glance with one of the other investigators. "Would you be willing to look at the final photographs? They might help us understand what happened." They set up a laptop computer on the portable table, the modern technology jarring against the ancient forest backdrop. As the images loaded, Ethan found himself looking at their honeymoon through Marina's eyes. There he was on their first day, loading their suitcases into Sage's trunk, grinning at something Marina had said. Another shot showed him driving, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching toward her camera with mock protest. The photographs captured their joy, their easy intimacy, the way they'd moved through those first 2 days of marriage, like people discovering a new country together. But as Detective Chen advanced through the frames, Ethan noticed a subtle shift. The compositions became less spontaneous, more watchful. Several shots seemed to be taken from hiding, Ethan unaware of the camera, caught in unguarded moments. "This is where it changes," Detective Chen said quietly. The final series of photographs were different entirely. Dark, shaky, obviously taken in haste. Ethan saw flashes of forest, fragments of their campsite, and then, "Oh God," his voice cracked. The last photograph showed Marina herself, reflected in the Beetle's side mirror. Her face was pale, eyes wide with an emotion Ethan had never seen before. Fear, raw, immediate terror that transformed her familiar features into something almost unrecognizable. "The final frame," Detective Chen said, advancing to the last image. This one was a video still, clearly captured from the camera's movie mode. Marina was running, the image blurred by motion and panic. But at the bottom of the frame, burned into the digital file like a confession, were the words she'd spoken into the camera's microphone. He's not who you think he is. Ethan stared at the screen until his eyes watered. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd married, the woman whose disappearance had haunted him for 22 years, had been running from him. The final evidence of her life was a warning about him. Mr. Wells, I need you to think carefully about that last day. What do you remember about your wife's behavior? About your own actions? The question felt like an accusation, wrapped in professional courtesy. Ethan closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that June morning in 2003. They'd camped at the established site near a small lake, planning to hike one of the forest trails after breakfast. Marina had been quiet, but he'd attributed it to the early hour and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. She was taking pictures, he said slowly. She always took pictures. That's what she did. Did you argue? Was there any tension between you? No. The word came out too forcefully, drawing looks from the other investigators. No, we didn't argue. We were on our honeymoon. We were happy. But even as he said it, Ethan felt something shifting in his memory, like looking at a familiar photograph from a different angle. Had Marina been happy that last morning? Or had there been something else in her silence, something he'd missed or chosen not to see? Detective Chen studied him with the careful attention of someone trained to read deception in body language and tone. Mr. Wells, 22 years ago, when your wife first disappeared, you told the investigating officers that you woke up that morning and she was simply gone. You said you assumed she'd gone for a walk to take photographs. That's right, but you didn't look for her immediately. You waited several hours before contacting authorities. The old shame rose in his throat like bile. This was the part of the story he'd relived countless times, the detail that had made him a suspect in the eyes of investigators and neighbors alike. I thought she needed space. Marina liked solitude when she was working. I didn't want to crowd her. For 6 hours. I fell asleep again. The admission felt like a betrayal of Marina's memory. I'd been working long hours before the wedding, saving up time off. I was exhausted. It sounded weak even to his own ears, this explanation he'd given so many times it had worn smooth like a stone. But it was the truth, or at least the truth as he remembered it. He'd awakened around sunrise to find Marina's side of their small tent empty, her camera bag gone. He'd assumed she'd risen early to catch the morning light, a habit of hers he'd learned to accommodate. When the sun climbed higher and she still hadn't returned, he'd made coffee and waited. Then breakfast, eating her portion along with his own, telling himself she'd be hungry when she came back with whatever images had captured her attention. By noon, worry had begun to gnaw at him. By mid-afternoon, it had transformed into panic. He'd searched the immediate area around their campsite, calling her name until his voice grew hoarse. Finally, as the day stretched toward evening, he'd driven to the nearest ranger station to report her missing. The search teams found no trace of her, Detective Chen continued. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate which direction she might have gone. That's what they told me then. And now we know why. She didn't leave on foot. She took the car. The statement hit Ethan like a physical blow. He turned to stare at the moss-covered beetle, trying to process this fundamental revision of everything he'd believed about Marina's disappearance. She drove here, he said slowly. She left me at the campsite and drove here. It appears so. The question is why, and why she felt the need to leave that message about you. Ethan sank back down onto the fallen log, the weight of 2 decades worth of assumptions crumbling around him. All these years, he'd pictured Marina lost in the forest, perhaps injured or disoriented, dying alone while he slept peacefully in their tent. The guilt of that imagined scenario had shaped every day since, driving him to the quiet isolation of seaside, to a life carefully constructed around the wound of his failure to protect her. But Marina hadn't been lost. She'd left him deliberately, driven to this remote place by some knowledge that had terrified her enough to abandon their marriage. Their plans, their life together, Mr. Wells. Detective Chen's voice was gentler now, perhaps recognizing the devastation in his posture. Is there anything else you can tell us about that trip? Anything that might help us understand what your wife discovered? Ethan shook his head, the motion feeling disconnected from conscious thought. I don't understand any of this. Marina loved me. We were happy. Why would she run from me? But even as he spoke the words, something else was surfacing in his memory, fragments of that last day that he'd buried under years of grief and self-recrimination. Marina had been taking photographs, yes, but not of the landscape. She'd been photographing him, capturing him in unguarded moments when he thought she wasn't looking, and there had been something in her eyes during those final hours. Something he'd mistaken for the contemplative mood that often preceded her best work. But looking back now with the terrible clarity of hindsight, he wondered if what he'd seen hadn't been artistic inspiration at all. It had been the careful observation of someone gathering evidence. Detective Chen handed him a business card. We're going to need you to stay in the area for a few days while we process the scene. Can you recommend a motel? Ethan pocketed the card without looking at it. There's a place in government camp, the Edelweiss Inn. We'll be in touch soon. And Mr. Wells? I know this is overwhelming, but finding the car is progress. For the first time in 22 years, we have real evidence. We're going to find out what happened to Marina. As the investigation team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave the forest, Ethan remained seated on the fallen log, staring at the car that had carried his wife away from him and into whatever fate awaited her in these dark woods. The late afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows between the towering trees. Soon the forest would be claimed by darkness, the same darkness that had swallowed Marina 22 years ago. But now he knew she hadn't simply vanished into the wilderness like mist. She'd run from him, carrying some terrible knowledge that had transformed love into fear, trust into terror, and somewhere in these woods she had died with that knowledge, taking the truth about Ethan Wells to whatever grave the forest had provided. The Edelweiss Inn sat at the base of Mount Hood, like a relic from another era, its A-frame structure and carved wooden balconies evoking the Swiss chalets it was meant to emulate. Ethan had stayed here once before, during a weekend ski trip with Marina early in their relationship. The memory felt like looking at someone else's life through warped glass. He checked into the same room they'd shared that winter weekend, though he couldn't say why he'd requested it specifically. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, had recognized his name when he signed the register. Terrible business, she'd said quietly. Finding that poor girl's car after all these years. The whole town's been talking about it. Ethan had nodded and taken his key, unwilling to correct her assumption about what they'd found. Let them think Marina's body had been discovered. The truth, that she was still missing, still out there somewhere in the vast wilderness, was harder to explain and impossible to bear. Sleep came in fragments that first night, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories trying to surface. He woke repeatedly to the sound of rain against the windows, each time expecting to find Marina beside him, only to remember where he was and why. By morning the rain had stopped, leaving the mountain air clean and sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth. Over coffee in the inn's small restaurant, Ethan made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He was going back to Portland. There were things he needed to understand about Marina's final days, details that might explain the fear he'd seen in that last photograph. If she'd discovered something about him, something terrible enough to make her run, he had to know what it was. The drive back to Portland took him through familiar territory that felt strange, as if the landscape itself had shifted during his 22-year absence. The city had grown, sprawled, transformed itself around the bones of the place he'd once called home. But some things remained unchanged. The river, the bridges, the way the afternoon light fell across the West Hills. He found their old apartment building in southeast Portland exactly as he remembered it. A 3-story brick structure with bay windows and a front garden that the current tenants had allowed to grow wild with blackberry vines and volunteer sunflowers. Ethan sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the second-floor window where he and Marina had spent the brief, bright months of their marriage. The building's manager, was a different person now. A young man with elaborate tattoos who consulted computer records instead of handwritten ledgers. But when Ethan explained who he was and why he'd come, the manager's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something approaching reverence. "Dude, that's heavy," he said, then seemed to catch himself. I'm sorry for your loss. That must have been incredibly difficult. I'm wondering about storage," Ethan said. "My wife might have rented storage space in the building or nearby. Is there any way to check records from 2003? The manager disappeared into a back office and returned with a dusty file box. The previous owner kept everything. Paranoid about lawsuits, apparently. He rifled through manila folders until he found what he was looking for. "Here, M. Wells, Unit 3B, rental agreement dated April 2003. Ethan's hands trembled as he examined the document. Marina's careful handwriting spelled out her new married name, the address of their apartment, the monthly rental fee of $45. She'd signed a year-long lease just 2 months before their honeymoon. "The unit's been abandoned for years," the manager explained. "We sent notices, tried to contact next of kin, but nothing. Eventually, we just wrote it off. Storage units become like archaeological sites around here. People forget they exist. Unit 3B was in the building's basement, a narrow room with concrete walls and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The manager cut the ancient padlock with bolt cutters, the metal parting with a sharp crack that echoed in the confined space. Inside, Ethan found the careful archaeology of a relationship he thought he'd understood completely. Marina's photography equipment filled most of the space. Tripods, lighting gear, boxes of film and chemicals for her darkroom work. But it was the portfolio cases that drew his attention. Professional-grade leather binders that he'd never seen before. The first portfolio contained Marina's familiar work, the street photography, the candid portraits, the landscapes that had filled their apartment walls. But the second portfolio was different. These photographs were systematic, methodical, almost clinical in their precision. They were all of him. Ethan found himself looking at dozens of images taken without his knowledge in the weeks leading up to their wedding. Marina had documented his daily routines with the patience of a surveillance professional, leaving for work, stopping at the corner grocery store, talking with neighbors, fixing Mrs. Chen's ancient Buick in the building's parking lot. The photographs were beautiful in the way that only Marina's work could be, each image perfectly composed and lit, but they felt invasive, unsettling, as if he were looking at evidence of a crime he didn't remember committing. At the bottom of the portfolio, he found a business card tucked into one of the protective sleeves. Thomas Morrison, private investigator, was printed in conservative black letters, along with a downtown Portland address and phone number. Ethan studied the card until the letters blurred. Why would Marina hire a private investigator? What had she been trying to learn about him that she couldn't simply ask? He thought back to their courtship, searching for signs he might have missed. Marina had asked questions about his childhood, his family, his life before they'd met. But her curiosity had seemed natural, the normal interest of someone falling in love. He'd answered honestly, or at least as honestly as he could manage. There were parts of his past that he'd never discussed with anyone, painful memories from his childhood that seemed irrelevant to the man he'd become. His father's abandonment, his mother's death, the difficult years with his grandmother, who'd loved him but struggled with her own demons. Every family had its shadows, he'd reasoned. Marina didn't need to inherit his, but apparently she'd decided to investigate those shadows herself. Ethan gathered the portfolios and photography equipment, loading everything into his truck with the same care Marina would have shown. Whatever she'd discovered about him, whatever truth had sent her running into the forest that final morning, the answers might be hidden in these careful documentation of their life together. The address on Thomas Morrison's business card led to a narrow office building downtown, wedged between a coffee roastery and a vintage clothing store. The directory in the lobby listed Morrison as occupying Suite 412, but when Ethan took the elevator to the 4th floor, he found the office empty except for water stains on the carpet and the lingering smell of old cigarettes. A sign on the door directed inquiries to the building management company. The property manager, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, consulted her computer and shook her head. Morrison moved out about 15 years ago. Medical issues, I think. But he might still be around town. Have you tried the White Pages? Thomas Morrison lived in a small house in the Woodstock neighborhood, a 1940s bungalow with a well-maintained garden and a wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. Ethan knocked tentatively, unsure what he would say to the man who had investigated him on behalf of his own wife. The door opened to reveal a man in his 70s, thin and sharp-eyed despite his obvious frailty. He studied Ethan's face for a long moment before recognition dawned. "Ethan Wells," Morrison said. "It wasn't a question, Mr. Morrison. I'm sorry to bother you, but I found your business card among my wife's things. Marina Wells. She hired you in 2003. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I heard they found the car. I'm sorry about your wife. She was a good woman, just trying to understand something that troubled her. What did she want you to investigate?" Morrison gestured for Ethan to enter, leading him slowly through a living room filled with the accumulated comfort of a long life. Book-lined walls, family photographs, a cat sleeping in a patch of afternoon sunlight. "Coffee?" Morrison asked, settling into a worn leather chair. "This might take a while." As Morrison prepared coffee with the deliberate movements of someone for whom each task required careful planning, Ethan studied the photographs on the mantelpiece. Morrison, with a woman who was probably his wife, both of them younger, standing in front of various landmarks around the world. Morrison in military uniform, serious and straight-backed. Her family gathered around a Christmas tree, multiple generations smiling at the camera. "Marina came to me in April 2003, Morrison said, returning with 2 mugs. "About 6 weeks before your wedding, if I remember correctly. She wanted a background check. On me, on you. She said she loved you, but that there were gaps in your story, inconsistencies that bothered her. Things you'd said about your childhood that didn't quite add up." Ethan set down his coffee cup with unsteady hands. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Morrison reached for a file folder that had been sitting on the side table, as if he'd been expecting this conversation for 22 years. "Your grandmother, for instance. You told Marina she'd raised you from age 9 after your mother died in a car accident. But when Marina tried to find records of that accident, she couldn't. No death certificate, no newspaper reports, no police records. Maybe she looked in the wrong place. Maybe, but then there were the school records. Marina found enrollment records for Ethan Wells at Jefferson Elementary through 3rd grade. After that, nothing until high school, when Ethan Wells suddenly reappeared in the system as a transfer student from Eastern Oregon. Morrison opened the file and spread several documents across the coffee table between them. Ethan recognized official letterheads, photocopied forms, the careful documentation of a professional investigation. "Your wife was thorough," Morrison continued. "She tracked down former neighbors, teachers, anyone who might remember the Wells family from that period. What she found was strange. People remembered a boy named Ethan Wells, but they also remembered that he died in some kind of accident when he was 12. The room seemed to tilt around Ethan. He gripped the arms of his chair, fighting a sudden wave of dizziness. "That's impossible." That's what Marina said at first. But then she found this. Morrison handed him a photocopied death certificate, the paper yellowed with age, but the text still clearly legible. "Ethan Michael Wells, age 12, died June 15th, 1985. Cause of death listed as accidental drowning." Ethan stared at the document until the words lost all meaning. His own name, his birth date, his parents' names. Everything was correct except for the fundamental fact of his existence. "There's more," Morrison said gently. "Records show that the Wells family had 2 boys. Ethan, the older brother, and Marcus, who was 2 years younger. After Ethan's death, the family moved away. No forwarding address, no trace of where they went." "Marcus," Ethan whispered. The name felt familiar and foreign at the same time, like a word in a language he'd once known, but forgotten. Marina was convinced there had been some kind of mistake, Morrison continued, or that someone had deliberately obscured the records. She paid me to keep digging, to find out what really happened to the Wells family after 1985. And did you? Morrison shook his head. I ran out of leads about the time Marina disappeared. After that, well, it seemed wrong to keep investigating a dead woman's suspicions about her husband's identity. Ethan stood abruptly, the need for fresh air overwhelming. I should go. Mr. Wells, or whoever you are, Marina loved you. That much was clear. But she was afraid she was marrying a stranger. Maybe even afraid she was marrying a dead man. Outside Morrison's house, Ethan sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the photocopied death certificate. The signature at the bottom belonged to a coroner he'd never heard of, in a county he'd never lived in, documenting the death of a boy who looked exactly like him at age 12. But he wasn't dead. He was 52 years old, sitting in a truck in Portland, Oregon, holding evidence that he'd died in 1985. Either the records were wrong, or everything he thought he knew about his own life was a lie. The address Morrison had given him led to a part of East Portland Ethan barely recognized, where small houses from the 1950s sat side by side with newer developments and apartment complexes. The neighborhood his grandmother had called home for 40 years had been transformed by time and gentrification. But Mrs. Rodriguez still lived in the same yellow house with the rose garden that had been her pride for as long as he could remember. She was 87 now, moving slowly, but with the deliberate grace of someone who refused to surrender to age. When she opened the door and saw Ethan standing on her porch, her weathered face broke into a smile that was equal parts joy and sorrow. Marcus, she said, and the name hit him like a physical blow. Oh, my dear boy, I heard about Marina on the news. I'm so sorry, Marcus. She'd called him Marcus. Mrs. Rodriguez, he managed, his voice sounding strange and distant. I was hoping we could talk. She ushered him into a living room that smelled of vanilla and old roses, the same scents he remembered from childhood, visits when his grandmother would bring him here for coffee, and conversation in Spanish he pretended not to understand. Mrs. Rodriguez had been his grandmother's closest friend, the only person who'd ever really known their family's secrets. You look tired, mi nieto, she said, settling into her familiar chair by the window. This business with the car, with Marina, it must be bringing back difficult memories. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to ask you about something. About my brother. Her expression shifted, the warmth replaced by something more guarded. Marcus, your grandmother made me promise never to speak of Ethan. She said it would only cause you pain. The confirmation felt like stepping off a cliff. Ethan, no, Marcus, sank into the chair across from her, the same chair he'd occupied as a boy, while the adults talked around him in voices too low for him to hear. Please, he said, I need to understand what happened. My wife hired a private investigator before she disappeared. She found records that suggest Ethan died in 1985. Mrs. Rodriguez closed her eyes, the decision to speak written in the lines of her face. Your grandmother loved you both so much. When Ethan died, she thought she'd lost everything. You were all she had left. Tell me about the accident. It wasn't an accident, Marcus. Not really? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Ethan had problems, even as a little boy. Anger problems, violence. Your parents tried to get him help, but in those days, people didn't understand children like Ethan. Marcus felt the room spinning around him. Memories trying to surface like objects floating up from deep water. What kind of violence? He hurt people. Animals first, then other children. Your parents were terrified of what he might do, but they didn't know how to stop him. And you were so young, but you tried to protect everyone from your brother's rages. I don't remember. Your grandmother said that was a blessing. She said you were too young to carry such memories. Mrs. Rodriguez reached for a photograph album on the side table, turning pages until she found what she was looking for. Here, this is the only picture she kept of both of you together. The photograph showed two boys standing in front of a small house Marcus didn't recognize. The older boy, Ethan, had dark hair and eyes that seemed too intense for his age. The younger boy, Marcus himself stood slightly behind his brother, one hand clutching Ethan's shirt, the other raised as if to shield his face from the camera. "You were 9 when it happened," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "There was a girl in the neighborhood, Sarah Chen. She was Ethan's age, 12, and she'd been kind to you when the other children teased you for being small. Ethan became obsessed with her, following her home from school, leaving strange gifts on her doorstep." Marcus stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the faces with his fragmented memories. The name Sarah Chen triggered something, a flash of recognition that felt both familiar and terrifying. "One day, Ethan convinced you to help him play a game with Sarah. He said he wanted to show her something special in the woods behind your house. You were just a child, Marcus. You didn't understand what your brother was really planning. What happened?" Mrs. Rodriguez's hands shook as she turned the photograph face down. "Ethan hurt her badly. When you realized what was happening, you tried to stop him. There was a struggle near the creek that ran through those woods. Ethan fell and hit his head on the rocks. The memories surfaced suddenly, brutally, like breaking through ice into freezing water." Marcus saw it all with crystalline clarity. Sarah Chen's terrified face, Ethan's hands around her throat, his own desperate attempt to pull his brother away. The sickening sound of Ethan's head striking stone, the sudden silence that followed. He died instantly. Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, "Sarah was badly hurt but alive. Your parents found you sitting by the creek, covered in blood, trying to wake Ethan up. And Sarah, she survived, but she was never the same. The trauma, it affected her memory, her ability to speak clearly about what happened. The police investigated, but without Sarah's testimony, and with Ethan dead, they eventually ruled it an accidental drowning." Marcus felt something breaking apart inside his chest, some fundamental structure of his identity crumbling like a building in an earthquake. "What about me? What about Marcus? Your grandmother made a decision that haunts me to this day," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "She couldn't bear to lose both boys. She told the authorities that Marcus had also died in the accident, that both children had drowned. Then she moved away with you and began raising you as Ethan. She made me into my dead brother. She thought she was saving you. You were so traumatized, so guilt-ridden about what had happened. The therapist said you might never recover if you had to carry the memory of Ethan's death. So your grandmother gave you a new story, a new identity. She told you that you were Ethan, that Marcus was just an imaginary friend you'd had as a small child." The room was spinning now, reality shifting like sand beneath his feet. Every memory he'd treasured, every story his grandmother had told him about his childhood, was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect him from the truth of what he'd witnessed, what he'd done. The hospital records, he said, grasping for solid ground. The therapy sessions when I was young, all under the name Ethan Wells. Your grandmother was very thorough. She created an entirely new life for you, complete with forged documents and a fabricated history. The only people who knew the truth were your parents, and they died in that car accident when you were 16. After that, it was just you and your grandmother, living a lie that had become its own kind of truth." Marcus thought about the man he'd become. The careful, gentle mechanic who fixed broken things with infinite patience. Had that personality been his own, or had it been carefully cultivated to ensure he would never become like the brother whose identity he'd inherited? "Marina found out," he said. "She was a smart woman, and she loved you enough to dig for the truth. Your grandmother always worried that someone would eventually uncover the deception. Is that why she never wanted me to marry? Why she seemed nervous whenever I brought Marina around?" Mrs. Rodriguez nodded sadly. "She was terrified that Marina would discover the secret and that you would lose the only life you'd ever known. But she was also afraid of something else." "What?" "That the memories would come back. That learning about Marcus and Ethan would trigger something in you that had been carefully suppressed for decades." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over Mrs. Rodriguez's garden. The roses were in full bloom, their red petals bright against the afternoon sky. "Marina was afraid of me. In the forest on our honeymoon. She was running from me. Perhaps she was running from Ethan. Mrs. Rodriguez suggested gently. Perhaps she'd discovered the truth about your brother and didn't know how to tell you. Or perhaps she was afraid that learning about your past would change you into someone she didn't recognize. But I'm not Ethan. I never was. No, mi nieto. You are Marcus. You have always been Marcus. Your grandmother's love couldn't change that. No matter how desperately she wanted to protect you from the truth. Marcus turned from the window to face the woman who had kept his family's secret for 37 years. There's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told me. Mrs. Rodriguez aged 10 years in the space of a single breath. Detective Chen called me this morning. Sarah Chen. She's with the Oregon State Police now. The name hit him like a lightning bolt. Sarah Chen, the girl his brother had attacked, the girl he'd tried to save. She was the detective investigating Marina's disappearance. She knows who I am, Marcus said. She's always known. When your grandmother moved you away and changed your identity, Sarah never forgot the boy who saved her life. She's been watching from a distance, making sure you stayed the person you were supposed to be, instead of becoming the monster your brother was. Marcus sank back into his chair, the full weight of revelation settling over him like a shroud. She's been investigating me all these years? Not investigating, protecting. Sarah became a police officer partly because of what happened to her as a child. She wanted to make sure that people like your brother could never hurt anyone again. But she also wanted to make sure that people like you, the innocent ones caught in the aftermath, could have a chance at normal lives. And now she's the one trying to find out what happened to Marina. Mrs. Rodriguez reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand in her weathered fingers. Marcus, whatever happened in that forest, whatever Marina discovered about your past, you need to remember that you are not your brother. You never were. The violence, the anger that consumed Ethan, that was never part of who you are. But even as she spoke the words, Marcus felt something dark stirring in the depths of his memory. Images that might have been dreams, or might have been suppressed recollections, flashes of anger, moments when the careful control he'd maintained his entire adult life had threatened to slip. Had there been other incidents over the years? Times when the false identity his grandmother had created had cracked, allowing glimpses of something darker to emerge. He thought about the gaps in his memory from that final day with Marina, the hours he claimed to have spent sleeping while she photographed him without his knowledge. I need to see the hospital records, he said. The real ones from when I was Marcus. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Your grandmother kept everything in a safety deposit box at the bank. She left the key with me, along with instructions to give it to you if you ever needed to know the truth. The key was small and brass, worn smooth by decades of handling. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed it into his palm along with a slip of paper bearing the name and address of a bank in Southeast Portland. There are things in that box that will be difficult to see, she warned. Pictures, medical reports, police statements from the investigation. Your grandmother saved everything because she thought someday you might need proof of who you really are. Marcus pocketed the key and stood to leave. But Mrs. Rodriguez caught his arm. Marcus, there's one more thing. Something I should have told you years ago. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone her age. The day Ethan died, when the police came to investigate, Sarah tried to tell them what really happened. She said that Ethan had been hurting her, that Marcus had saved her life. But the trauma had affected her speech, and the adults assumed she was confused, mixing up the brothers' names. What are you saying? For 37 years, Sarah Chen has carried the knowledge that you are a hero, not a victim. That you risked your own life to save hers when you were just 9 years old. Whatever fear Marina might have felt in those final days, it wasn't based on who you really are. It was based on the lie your grandmother created to protect you. The drive to the bank passed in a blur of Portland traffic and conflicting emotions. Marcus felt as if he were being torn apart by competing versions of himself. The careful, gentle man he'd been raised to be, and the traumatized child whose true identity had been buried under decades of false memories. The safety deposit box was larger than he'd expected, filled with manila envelopes and document folders that represented the careful preservation of a family's darkest secrets. Marcus spread the contents across the bank's small viewing room table, creating an archaeological record of tragedy and deception. The hospital records painted a picture of a severely traumatized 9-year-old boy who had witnessed horrors no child should see. Dr. Margaret Foster's notes described a patient who alternated between catatonic silence and violent episodes, who spoke repeatedly about saving Sarah and stopping Ethan until the medical staff began to understand the scope of what had occurred. But it was the photographs that broke. Something inside Marcus's chest, pictures of Sarah, Chen as she'd been found that day, a 12-year-old girl with bruises around her throat and terror in her eyes. Medical photographs documenting her injuries. And then, more difficult to look at, pictures of Marcus himself as he'd been brought to the hospital. He'd been so small, this boy who'd tried to fight a brother 2 years older and consumed by rage. His clothes were torn and bloody, his face marked by scratches and bruises. But what struck Marcus most was the expression in his own young eyes. Not fear or confusion, but a kind of devastating clarity, as if he'd understood exactly what he'd witnessed and what he'd been forced to do. The final envelope contained items Marcus had never seen before. Letters his grandmother had written, but never sent, documenting her agonizing decision to erase her grandson's identity in order to save his sanity. "My dear Marcus," one letter began, "I pray that someday you will understand why I made the choice I did. You saved that little girl's life, but you also had to watch your brother die because of your actions. No child should carry such a burden. If giving you Ethan's name and Ethan's life can give you peace, then I will gladly sacrifice the truth for your happiness." Another letter, written years later. "You ask sometimes about Marcus, the imaginary friend you think you remember from childhood. I tell you he was just a game you played, but you are so much more than that. You are the best parts of both my grandsons, Marcus's courage and compassion, but none of Ethan's darkness. I only hope that when you finally learn the truth, you will forgive an old woman's desperate love." Marcus sat in the bank's viewing room for over an hour, reading and rereading the documents that revealed the true story of his life. By the time he finally packed everything back into the safety deposit box, the afternoon shadows were growing long across the city. But one document remained in his hands, Dr. Foster's final report, dated 3 months after the incident. According to her notes, Marcus had made remarkable progress in therapy, his violent episodes subsiding as he learned to process his trauma in healthy ways. But she'd also noted something that chilled Marcus to the bone: patient exhibits concerning gaps in memory regarding the day of the incident. While this may be a natural defense mechanism, there remains some question about exactly what occurred during the confrontation with his brother. Patient's account varies in small but significant details from session to session, even as a traumatized 9-year-old. Marcus hadn't been able to remember exactly what had happened in those crucial moments by the creek. And now, 37 years later, he was beginning to wonder if those gaps in memory might be the key to understanding what had frightened Marina enough to run into the forest that final morning. What if she hadn't just discovered the truth about his identity? What if she'd uncovered something else, something even the medical records couldn't reveal, about what had really happened the day Ethan Wells died? The storage unit his grandmother had rented was in a facility that looked like it had been forgotten by time. A collection of metal buildings at the edge of Portland's industrial district, surrounded by chain-link fence and security cameras that probably hadn't worked in years. The manager, a man who seemed to have evolved specifically for the task of guarding other people's abandoned belongings, barely looked up when Marcus presented the key and rental agreement he'd found among his grandmother's papers. Unit 47 was larger than he'd expected, a space that could have housed a small apartment. When Marcus raised the rolling door, the smell that emerged was the particular mustiness of a place where memories go to die: cardboard, dust, and the faint chemical tang of old photographs. His grandmother had been systematic in her preservation of the past. Boxes were labeled in her careful handwriting: Marcus, age 5'9", medical records, legal documents, personal effects. But it was the unlabeled box in the back corner that drew his attention, the one wrapped in brown paper and tied with string like a package that was never meant to be opened. Inside, Marcus found the artifacts of a childhood he'd been trained to forget. The drawings were the first things he saw, and they stopped his breath in his throat. Crude figures rendered in crayon by a child's hand, but depicting scenes of violence that no 9-year-old should have been able to imagine. Stick figures with red scribbles for blood, dark shapes with angry faces looming over smaller, frightened forms, and written in a child's careful printing at the bottom of each page, Marcus saved Sarah from the bad Ethan. There were dozens of them, apparently drawn during his therapy sessions with Dr. Foster. Marcus could see the progression in the artwork. The early drawings were chaotic, almost abstract in their representation of trauma. But as the weeks passed, the images became more detailed, more specific. The final drawings in the sequence showed a small figure pushing a larger one toward what looked like water. With the words, "Marcus was brave," written beneath, he'd drawn his own heroic narrative even as a traumatized child. But looking at the pictures now, Marcus wondered if they represented memory or wish fulfillment. Had he really saved Sarah Chen? Or had he simply told himself that story to make sense of a tragedy beyond his comprehension? Beneath the drawings, he found audio cassette tapes labeled with dates from 1985. Dr. Foster's therapy sessions, apparently recorded for posterity. Marcus hadn't seen a cassette player in years, but his grandmother had included one in the box. An ancient Sony device that clicked and whirred when he pressed play. His own voice emerged from the speakers. High and thin and heartbreakingly young, Ethan was hurting Sarah. She was crying and asking him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. I tried to talk to him, but he got angry at me too. Dr. Foster's gentle prompting, "What happened next, Marcus?" I don't remember exactly. There was pushing, and then Ethan fell down and hit his head on the rocks. There was so much blood, and he wouldn't wake up. I tried to help him, but I couldn't make him better. You did your best, Marcus. Sometimes people get hurt even when we're trying to help them. But I killed my brother. The words hung in the air of the storage unit like an accusation. Marcus stopped the tape, his hands shaking as he stared at the cassette player. Even as a child, he'd understood the fundamental truth that everyone else had tried to help him forget. He was responsible for Ethan's death. The next tape was from several weeks later. His voice sounded stronger, more confident. "Dr. Foster says I saved Sarah's life. She says Ethan was very sick in his mind and that he might have killed Sarah if I hadn't stopped him. She says that makes me brave, not bad." That's right, Marcus. You protected someone who couldn't protect herself. That's what brave people do. But why can't I remember everything? Sometimes I think I remember pushing Ethan really hard, like I was angry and wanted to hurt him. But other times I think it was an accident, like he just fell when I was trying to get him away from Sarah. Dr. Foster's pause was audible on the old tape. Sometimes our minds protect us from memories that are too difficult to carry. It doesn't matter exactly how Ethan fell, Marcus. What matters is that you tried to save Sarah, and you succeeded. Marcus fast-forwarded through several more sessions, listening to his younger self slowly construct a narrative of heroism from the fragments of trauma. But it was the final tape that made him understand why his grandmother had hidden these records away. "I had another dream about that day," his 9-year-old voice said. "But this time I remembered something new. When Ethan was hurting Sarah, I got so angry. Angrier than I've ever been in my whole life. It felt like there was something dark inside me, something that wanted to hurt Ethan the way he was hurting Sarah. And when I pushed him, I wasn't trying to save him from falling. I wanted him to fall. I wanted him to get hurt." Dr. Foster's response was measured, careful. Anger is a normal response when we see someone we care about being hurt, Marcus. Feeling angry doesn't make you a bad person, but what if I'm like Ethan? What if I have the same bad thoughts he had? You're not like Ethan. You proved that when you chose to protect Sarah instead of hurting her. The fact that you're worried about being like your brother shows that you're nothing like him at all. Marcus turned off the cassette player and sat in the dusty silence of the storage unit, processing what he'd heard. The therapy sessions revealed a truth more complex than the simple narrative of heroism his grandmother had tried to create. Yes, he'd saved Sarah Chen, but he'd also killed his brother, and some part of him had wanted to do it. The final box in the storage unit contained items that seemed almost mundane after the psychological archaeology of the therapy sessions. School records for Marcus Wells, showing a bright child who'd excelled in his studies before the trauma. Report cards that documented his transformation from an outgoing, social boy to someone who preferred solitude and careful routines. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, Marcus found something that stopped his heart. It was a child's drawing, but not one of the violent images from the therapy sessions. This picture showed two boys standing by a creek, holding hands and smiling. One was taller, darker, with eyes that seemed too old for his face. The other was smaller, lighter, with an expression of pure trust and love. At the bottom, in careful child's printing, were the words, "Ethan and Marcus, best brothers forever." The drawing was dated 2 weeks before the incident. Marcus stared at the picture until his eyes blurred with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. This was the truth his grandmother had tried to preserve. Not the violence and trauma that had defined their relationship's end, but the genuine love that had existed between two boys before mental illness and tragedy tore their family apart. His phone rang, startling him from his contemplation. Detective Chen's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus wondered if she could somehow sense that he'd finally learned the truth about who he really was. "Mr. Wells." Her voice was professionally neutral, but Marcus thought he detected an undercurrent of something else. "We need to talk. There have been some developments in the investigation." "What kind of developments?" "We found something else at the scene, something that changes our understanding of what happened to Marina. Can you meet me at the government camp ranger station in 2 hours?" Marcus looked around the storage unit, at the carefully preserved evidence of a childhood that had been hidden from him for 37 years. "I'll be there. And Mr. Wells, bring identification. We're going to need to verify some facts about your background." The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the artifacts of 2 different lives. The traumatized boy who'd killed his brother to save a stranger, and the man who'd been created from the ashes of that tragedy. Detective Sarah Chen knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. The question was whether she still saw him as the hero who'd saved her life, or as the killer who'd taken his brother's. As he packed up the storage unit, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the facility's grimy windows. For the first time in his life, he saw himself clearly, not as Ethan Wells, the identity his grandmother had created, but as Marcus Wells, the boy who'd made an impossible choice and spent the rest of his life living with the consequences. The drive back to Mount Hood took him through the same landscapes he'd traveled just days before, but everything looked different now. He wasn't the man who'd received Detective Chen's phone call about the discovered car. That man had been living a lie, however well-intentioned. Marcus Wells was someone else entirely, someone who'd been buried under decades of careful deception, but who was finally clawing his way back to the surface. Whatever Detective Chen had found at the scene, whatever new evidence had emerged about Marina's disappearance, Marcus was ready to face it with the full knowledge of who he really was. He'd spent 37 years running from the truth about that day by the creek. Now it was time to stop running and face whatever consequences awaited him in the forest where his wife had died, believing she was married to a dead man. The government camp ranger station sat in the shadow of Mount Hood like a monument to organized wilderness, its log cabin architecture and American flag suggesting order imposed on the chaos of nature. Detective Chen was waiting in the parking lot when Marcus arrived, leaning against her unmarked sedan, with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She looked older than he'd remembered from their first meeting. Lines of fatigue etched around her eyes. But when she turned to face him, Marcus saw something else in her expression, recognition that went deeper than their recent acquaintance. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly. The sound of his real name spoken aloud for the first time in decades hit him like a physical blow. Marcus stopped walking, his keys still clutched in his hand, and stared at the woman who'd carried the secret of his identity for 37 years. "You remember," he said. "It wasn't a question. I never forgot." "How could I forget the boy who saved my life?" Sarah Chen stepped forward, and Marcus could see the 12-year-old girl she'd once been flickering behind her adult features. "The question is, do you remember?" "Some of it. Enough to know that I killed my brother." Sarah's expression softened with something that might have been compassion or might have been relief. "You stopped a monster from murdering me." "There's a difference." They stood in the parking lot as afternoon shadows stretched across the mountain landscape. Two middle-aged adults connected by a childhood trauma that had shaped both their lives in fundamental ways. Marcus wondered how many times Sarah had thought about that day, whether she'd seen his face in her dreams the way he'd apparently seen Ethan's. "I need to show you something," Sarah said finally. "Something we found yesterday that changes everything about Marina's disappearance." She led him into the ranger station, past displays of local wildlife and hiking safety information, to a small conference room where evidence boxes and manila folders covered a table like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. But it was the laptop computer at the center of the table that drew Marcus's attention. "Marina had a safety deposit box," Sarah said, opening the laptop to reveal a scanned document. "We found the key among her personal effects at the storage unit." The box contained this. The document on the screen was a journal written in Marina's careful handwriting. Marcus recognized the paper. Expensive stationery she'd bought for special occasions, too good for everyday use. But these pages were filled with an obsessive documentation that made his skin crawl. Entry dated May 15th, 2003, Sarah read aloud. 3 weeks before your honeymoon. I hired Thomas Morrison today. I need to know the truth about Ethan's childhood. There are too many inconsistencies, too many stories that don't add up. I love him, but I can't marry someone I don't really know. Marcus sank into one of the plastic chairs, the institutional furniture creaking under his weight. She was investigating me before our wedding. Keep listening. May 22nd. Morrison found the death certificate. Ethan Wells died in 1985, age 12. So, who is the man I'm supposed to marry on Tuesday? Who has been living under a dead boy's name for 18 years? The words felt like accusations, each one a nail in the coffin of the life he'd thought he'd built with Marina. Sarah continued reading, her voice steady but not unkind. May 25th. I confronted Morrison about the possibility of mistaken records, but he's found too much evidence to ignore. There were 2 Wells boys, Ethan and Marcus. After Ethan's death, the family disappeared. No forwarding address, no trace of where they went. The man I love is either an imposter or a ghost. She could have asked me, Marcus said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. How do you ask someone if they're living under their dead brother's identity? How do you build a marriage on a foundation of secrets that fundamental? Sarah turned to another page. May 30th, 2 days before your wedding. I've decided to go through with the marriage. Whatever Ethan's real name is, whatever happened in his past, I love the man he's become. But I'm planning to use our honeymoon to tell him what I know. We'll be alone, away from everything, and we can figure out the truth together. I'm bringing a camera to document our conversation. If something happens to me, if he's not who I think he is, at least there will be evidence. The final entry was dated June 2nd, 2003, the morning of their departure for the honeymoon. I'm scared. Last night I dreamed about the boy who died by the creek. In the dream, he was angry at me for taking his name, his life, his identity. When I woke up, Ethan was sitting by the window, staring out at the street. He said he'd been having strange dreams too, memories that didn't feel like his own. I think the investigation triggered something in him, some buried trauma trying to surface. I have to be careful. how I approach this conversation. I have to make him understand that I love Marcus, not the ghost of Ethan. Sarah closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. She knew Marcus. Before you left on your honeymoon, Marina knew exactly who you were and what had happened to your brother. She wasn't running from you in that forest. She was trying to save you. Save me from what? From the lie your grandmother created. From the identity that was slowly killing the real you. Sarah pulled another document from the evidence boxes. We found Dr. Foster's contact information in Marina's notes. I spoke with her yesterday. Marcus felt his world tilting again, reality shifting like sand beneath his feet. Dr. Foster is still alive? She's 91 now, retired, but her memory is sharp. She remembers you clearly, Marcus. She said Marina called her in April 2003, asking about treatment options for someone suffering from dissociative identity disorder related to childhood trauma. Dissociative identity disorder? Marina was convinced that the false identity your grandmother created had started to fragment under stress. She thought you were experiencing episodes where Ethan's memories and personality were bleeding through into your consciousness. That's why she wanted to use the honeymoon to help you remember who you really were. Marcus thought about the gaps in his memory from that final day, the hours he claimed to have slept while Marina documented his behavior with her camera. What if she was right? What if there were episodes I don't remember? Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture that carried decades of understanding. Dr. Foster said that was impossible. She explained that you and Ethan were separate people, not alternate personalities. Your grandmother's deception might have confused your sense of identity, but it couldn't actually create a split personality. Whatever Marina saw in your behavior that frightened her, it wasn't Ethan coming back from the dead. Then what was it? I think it was you finally starting to remember the truth. And I think Marina recognized the signs of someone whose suppressed memories were trying to surface. Sarah opened another folder and spread several photographs across the table. They were crime scene photos from 1985, showing the creek where Ethan had died. Marcus recognized the location immediately, not from his own memories, but from dreams that had haunted him his entire adult life. Dr. Foster gave me permission to share something with you, Sarah said. Something she never told your grandmother because she thought it might interfere with your recovery. What? You saved my life that day, Marcus. But the way you did it, the precision, the timing, the fact that you managed to stop someone larger and stronger than you, it wasn't luck. You planned it. Marcus stared at the photographs, the black and white images triggering flashes of memory that felt both familiar and foreign. I was 9 years old. You were 9 years old and brilliant. Dr. Foster said your IQ tests showed exceptional intelligence, particularly in spatial reasoning and strategic thinking. When you saw what Ethan was doing to me, you didn't just react emotionally. You calculated the exact angle and force needed to push him toward the creek where the rocks were sharpest. You're saying I murdered my brother deliberately? I'm saying you executed a plan to save my life, knowing it would probably cost Ethan his. You made an adult decision with adult consequences, and you've been carrying adult guilt for something you did as a child. The revelation felt like stepping into sunlight after decades in darkness. Marcus had spent 37 years believing himself to be either a hero who'd accidentally caused his brother's death or a monster who'd killed in anger. The truth was more complex and somehow more bearable. He'd been a child who'd made an impossible choice with intelligence and courage beyond his years. Marina figured it out, he said slowly. She realized that the identity confusion wasn't creating a split personality. It was causing me to remember what I'd really done that day, and she was trying to help you integrate those memories in a healthy way. The camera footage, her final words about you not being who people thought you were. She wasn't warning people about Ethan coming back. She was trying to tell the world that you weren't the killer some people might assume you to be if they learned about your brother's death. Sarah gathered the photographs and documents, returning them to their folders with the methodical care of someone who'd spent a career organizing evidence into coherent narratives. There's one more thing, she said. We found Marina's body yesterday. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. After 3 days of revelations and reconstructed identities, the simple fact of Marina's death felt almost anticlimactic. But it was also a relief, an end to the uncertainty that had defined the last 22 years of his life. Where? About 2 miles from where we found the car, in a natural cave system that's been hidden by rockfall for decades. She survived for several days after leaving the campsite, apparently trying to find her way back to civilization. Marcus closed his eyes, imagining Marina alone in the darkness, lost and frightened, but still trying to find her way home to him. How did she die? Exposure and dehydration. But Marcus, she left something for you. Something that suggests she never stopped loving you, even after learning the truth about your identity. Sarah handed him a sealed evidence bag containing a piece of bark with words carved into its surface using what looked like a car key. The message was brief but unmistakable. Tell Marcus he was always my hero. For the first time since receiving the phone call about the discovered car, Marcus felt something other than confusion and grief. Marina had died knowing exactly who he was, and she'd loved him anyway. More than that, she'd loved him specifically because of who he was, not in spite of it. We'll need you to formally identify the remains, Sarah said gently. But after that, you're free to take her home, free to give her the burial she deserved 22 years ago. Marcus nodded, unable to trust his voice. Outside the conference room windows, the afternoon light was fading across Mount Hood's massive shoulders, casting the mountain in shades of gold and purple that Marina would have photographed if she'd lived to see them. Sarah, he said finally, using her first name for the first time since they'd been children. Thank you for becoming the person you became, for making sure justice existed in the world, even when it couldn't exist for us. Thank you for saving my life, she replied, and for becoming someone worthy of Marina's love. As they prepared to leave the ranger station, Marcus realized that the story he'd been living was finally complete. Not the false narrative his grandmother had created, or the partial truth he'd constructed from fragments of memory, but the full, complex reality of a life shaped by impossible choices and unimaginable love. He was Marcus Wells, and he was going home to bury his wife. Dr. Margaret Foster's assisted living facility sat on a hillside overlooking the Willamette Valley, its modern architecture and carefully landscaped gardens designed to suggest serenity and comfort in the final chapters of life. At 91, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose mind remained sharp even as her body surrendered to time's relentless advance. Marcus found her in the facility's library, a bright room filled with large print books and comfortable chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light. She looked up from her reading when he entered, and her eyes, still clear and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses, registered immediate recognition. Marcus Wells, she said, setting aside her book. I've been expecting you for 37 years. The simple statement carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of professional discretion finally coming to an end. Marcus took the chair across from her, studying the face that had been present during the most traumatic period of his childhood. Detective Chen said, "You spoke with Marina before our honeymoon." I did. She was a remarkable young woman, intelligent, compassionate, determined to understand the man she was about to marry. I told her as much as I could without violating patient confidentiality. Dr. Foster reached for a manila folder that had been sitting on the table beside her chair. But now that you're here, asking the questions yourself, I can share things I've kept secret for far too long. Sarah, Detective Chen, said you have session tapes from 1985. I have everything, Marcus. Your grandmother asked me to destroy the files when you turned 18, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I had a feeling that someday you would need to know the complete truth about what happened that day by the creek. Dr. Foster opened the folder to reveal documents that looked official and somehow ominous in their clinical precision. Marcus, there's something I need to tell you about your brother's death. Something I discovered during your therapy that I never shared with your grandmother because I thought it would complicate your recovery. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What kind of something? The autopsy report. I requested a copy as part of my assessment of your psychological state. According to the medical examiner, Ethan didn't die from hitting his head on the rocks. The words seemed to echo in the library's quiet space, carrying implications that Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to understand. Then how did he die? Drowning. He was unconscious when he fell into the creek, but he was still alive. The head injury would have been survivable if someone had pulled him from the water immediately. Marcus stared at Dr. Foster's lined face, trying to process what she was telling him. Are you saying I let him drown? I'm saying that a 9-year-old boy made a decision that saved one life and cost another. You had perhaps 30 seconds to choose between saving your brother, who had just attempted to murder a child, or ensuring that he could never hurt anyone again. The memory surfaced with crystalline clarity, as if Dr. Foster's words had unlocked a door that had been sealed for decades. Marcus saw himself standing by the creek, watching Ethan's unconscious form face down in the shallow water. He remembered the moment of choice, the calculation that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with cold, clear logic. Ethan was a killer. If Marcus saved him, he would kill again. Sarah Chen might not be his last victim. I watched him drown, Marcus said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. I stood there and watched my brother die. You made an impossible decision that no child should ever have to make. And then you spent the next 37 years believing yourself to be either a hero or a victim, when the truth was that you were something much more complex. A child who chose to sacrifice his brother to save a stranger. Dr. Foster pulled another document from the folder. This is why your grandmother's deception was so damaging, Marcus. She tried to erase not just your identity, but your agency in what happened that day. She wanted you to believe that Ethan's death was an accident, that you were simply an innocent bystander to tragedy. But I wasn't innocent. No, you weren't, but you also weren't guilty of murder. You were a 9-year-old boy who made a moral choice that most adults would struggle with. You chose to protect future victims over your own family loyalty. Marcus thought about the therapy sessions he'd heard on the cassette tapes, the way his younger self had struggled to reconcile his actions with his understanding of right and wrong. Is that why Marina was afraid? Because she figured out that I'd deliberately let Ethan die? Quite the opposite. Marina was afraid because she realized you'd been living with the psychological burden of that choice for decades without knowing you'd made it. She thought the false identity was preventing you from processing the decision in a healthy way. Dr. Foster leaned forward in her chair, her expression intense despite her age. Marcus, there's something else. Something I discovered when Marina contacted me that changes everything about your story. What? You weren't the only survivor that day. There was another witness to what happened by the creek. Someone who saw everything and chose to keep silent for 37 years. The revelation hit Marcus like lightning. Sarah? Detective Chen saw me let Ethan drown? No, not Sarah. She was unconscious by the time Ethan fell into the water. The witness was someone else entirely. Someone who was supposed to be dead. Dr. Foster reached into the folder and withdrew a photograph that made Marcus's world tilt on its axis. It showed 2 boys standing by a creek, but the image was different from the family photos he'd seen in his grandmother's storage unit. This picture had been taken from a distance, apparently without the subject's knowledge, and it showed a third figure partially hidden behind a tree, another boy, smaller and younger than both Ethan and Marcus. This photograph was taken the day before the incident, Dr. Foster continued, by a social worker who was investigating reports of violence in your household. She was documenting evidence of Ethan's behavioral problems when she captured this image. Marcus studied the photograph with growing confusion. I don't understand. Who is the third boy? Your younger brother, Marcus. The real Marcus Wells. The words hit him like a physical blow. Marcus felt the library spinning around him, reality fracturing like glass under pressure. That's impossible. I'm Marcus. No, Dr. Foster said gently. You're David. David Wells, the youngest of three brothers. You were 7 years old when Ethan died, not 9. The revelation tore through everything Marcus thought he knew about himself, about his family, about the fundamental facts of his existence. He gripped the arms of his chair, fighting a wave of dizziness that threatened to pull him under. The real Marcus was 10 when the incident occurred, Dr. Foster continued. He was the one who was supposed to have died that day, according to your grandmother's deception. But Marcus didn't die by the creek. He ran away during the chaos that followed Ethan's death, and he never came back. Where is he now? Dr. Foster pulled out another document, this one bearing an official letterhead from the Oregon Department of Human Services. Marcus Wells has been living under his own name for 37 years. He never changed his identity, never tried to hide from what happened. He became a social worker, specifically focused on helping children who've experienced trauma. The paper contained an address in Eugene, Oregon, and a phone number that seemed to glow with possibility and terror. David stared at the document until the letters blurred together. He knows about me. He's known where you were for decades. When your grandmother moved you away and began raising you as Ethan, Marcus tried to contact social services. But by then, the official records showed that both Ethan and Marcus Wells had died in the creek accident. The system had no way to process a dead boy trying to report that his living brother was being raised under a false identity. So he just gave up? He spent years trying to find you through unofficial channels. But your grandmother was very thorough in erasing David Wells from existence. She created new birth certificates, school records, medical histories, everything needed to transform a 7-year-old named David into a 9-year-old named Marcus. Dr. Foster's voice softened with something that might have been regret. I met with Marcus, the real Marcus, several times over the years. He wanted to reconnect with you, but he was afraid that learning the truth would destroy the life your grandmother had built. He's been watching from a distance, making sure you were safe and healthy, but never interfering. David felt as if he were drowning in his chair, pulled under by the weight of revelation after revelation. Everything he'd believed about himself, about his family, about the tragedy that had shaped his life, was built on layers of deception so complex they defied comprehension. Marina, he said suddenly. Did she know about David? About the real Marcus? She suspected there was another brother. That's why she hired the private investigator, why she was so determined to uncover the truth. But I don't think she ever imagined the full scope of your grandmother's deception. Dr. Foster reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on his arm. David, your grandmother loved you desperately. When she saw what the trauma had done to you, a 7-year-old who'd watched his brothers fight to the death, she made a decision born of pure desperation. She thought that giving you Marcus's identity would somehow protect you from the psychological damage of witnessing such violence. But I wasn't just a witness. I chose to let Ethan die. A 7-year-old doesn't have the cognitive development to make that kind of calculated decision. What you experienced was a traumatic freeze response, the natural reaction of a young child confronted with violence beyond their comprehension. Then why do I remember choosing? Why do I remember standing there deciding not to save him? Dr. Foster's expression grew more complex, layered with the weight of professional knowledge accumulated over decades. Because your grandmother's deception created false memories. By raising you as Marcus, she convinced you that you were older, more capable, more responsible for what happened than you actually were. The memories of deliberate choice are constructions built on the foundation of someone else's identity. David thought about the therapy sessions he'd heard on the cassette tapes, the way his younger self had struggled to reconcile conflicting versions of events. So everything I remember about that day is a lie? Not everything. You were there. You witnessed the confrontation between Ethan and Sarah Chen. You saw your brother fall into the creek and fail to emerge. But the complex moral calculations, the strategic thinking that led to Ethan's death, those belonged to Marcus. Not to you, Marcus was the one who chose to let Ethan drown. Marcus was 10 years old and had been living with Ethan's escalating violence for years. He'd seen what your brother was capable of, understood in a way that you couldn't, that Ethan would kill again if given the chance. When Ethan fell unconscious into the creek, Marcus made a decision that saved Sarah's life and prevented future murders. Dr. Foster pulled out one final document, a letter written in careful handwriting on stationery that bore yesterday's date. Marcus asked me to give you this, if you ever came looking for the truth. David's hands shook as he unfolded the letter, recognizing something familiar in the handwriting despite never having seen it before. Dear David, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means Dr. Foster has finally told you who you really are. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, even though I had to let you go to protect you from the truth of what I did by that creek. You were so young when it happened, barely more than a baby in my mind. You shouldn't have been there at all. But Ethan insisted on bringing you along to play with Sarah. When I realized what he was planning to do to her, I knew I had to stop him, even if it meant killing my own brother. You froze when Ethan attacked Sarah, which was exactly what any 7-year-old would do in that situation. But when Ethan fell into the creek and I had the chance to save him, I chose not to. I stood there and watched our brother drown because I knew he would kill again if I let him live. Grandmother couldn't accept that one of her grandsons was a killer. So she decided to erase both Marcus and David from existence. She kept you but gave you my name, my age, my identity. In her mind, she was creating a version of Marcus who was innocent of murder. A boy who had saved Sarah Chen by accident rather than by choice. But you were never me, David. You were always the sweet, gentle child who deserved protection from the violence that surrounded our family. The fact that you grew up to be kind and caring and capable of love proves that grandmother's sacrifice, however misguided, accomplished what she hoped for. I've built a good life for myself, working with children who've experienced trauma similar to ours. Every day, I try to honor Sarah Chen's survival and your innocence by helping other kids find their way back from darkness. If you want to meet, if you think it would help you understand who you really are, I'm ready. But if you prefer to keep living as Marcus, I'll respect that choice too. You've earned the right to be whoever brings you peace, with love and respect for the man you've become. Your brother Marcus, David, set the letter down with trembling hands, his entire sense of self reshaping itself around this new understanding of his place in the family tragedy. He wasn't the boy who'd saved Sarah Chen. He wasn't the child who'd made an impossible moral choice. He was simply David Wells, the youngest brother who'd witnessed something terrible and spent the rest of his life carrying someone else's guilt. Marina figured it out, didn't she? He said finally. That's why she was afraid during our honeymoon. She realized I was living as someone I wasn't, carrying memories and guilt that didn't belong to me. She was trying to help you remember who you really were. The camera footage, her final words, she wasn't warning people about you. She was trying to document the process of helping you reclaim your true identity. Dr. Foster closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly exhausted by the weight of secrets finally shared. David, there's one more thing you need to know. Marina didn't die of exposure in that cave. She died of a pre-existing heart condition that was triggered by stress and exhaustion. What kind of heart condition? One that she'd been hiding from you since before your marriage. She knew the stress of revealing the truth about your identity might be fatal, but she loved you enough to risk her life to set you free from your grandmother's deception. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Marina had died trying to save him from a lie that was slowly destroying his sense of self. She'd sacrificed her life to give him back his true identity, even knowing that the stress of the revelation might kill her. David Wells sat in the library of an assisted living facility, finally understanding who he was and what he'd lost. He wasn't a hero or a killer or a victim. He was simply a man who'd been loved enough by two women, his grandmother and his wife, that They'd been willing to die to protect him from truths they thought would destroy him, but the truth hadn't destroyed him. It had finally set him free. The courthouse in Eugene felt like a cathedral of bureaucracy, its marble halls and vaulted ceilings designed to inspire respect for the orderly process of justice and legal documentation. David Wells, he was trying to think of himself by his real name now, sat on a wooden bench outside the records office, holding the folder of documents that would officially restore his true identity, Detective Sarah. Chen had driven down from Portland to help navigate the legal complexities of resurrect someone who'd been officially dead for 37 years. The process was more complicated than either of them had anticipated, involving multiple government agencies and enough paperwork to reconstruct an entire life from scratch. It's not every day someone comes back from the dead, the clerk had explained with the weary humor of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human bureaucratic confusion. We'll need death certificates for both Marcus and Ethan Wells, plus documentation proving that David Wells is who he claims to be. The irony wasn't lost on David that he needed to prove his own existence to people who had no record of his birth, his childhood, or his legal right to exist under his own name. His grandmother's deception had been so thorough that David Wells existed only in the memories of people who'd known him before 1985. "There's someone here to see you," Sarah said, returning from the records office with an expression that mixed anticipation with concern. "He's been waiting in the lobby for over an hour." David looked through the courthouse's tall windows to see a man standing near the information desk, studying architectural details with the careful attention of someone trying to manage nervousness through distraction. He was shorter than David, with graying hair and a face that looked familiar in the way that dreams feel familiar, recognizable but impossible to place. "Marcus?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "Your brother drove down from his office as soon as he heard you were here. He wanted to be present when you officially became David Wells again." The reunion should have felt momentous, two brothers seeing each other for the first time in nearly 4 decades. But when David walked across the courthouse lobby and stood face to face with Marcus, what he felt was not the explosive emotion of a dramatic revelation, but rather the quiet recognition of something that had always been true. "Hello, David," Marcus said. And hearing his real name spoken by someone who'd known him as a child felt like waking up from a dream he hadn't realized he was having. "Hello, Marcus." They stood awkwardly in the bureaucratic bustle of the courthouse, two middle-aged men connected by shared trauma and decades of enforced separation. Marcus looked like David might have looked if he'd lived a different life, similar bone structure and coloring, but with the bearing of someone who'd spent years helping others rather than hiding from his own past. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Marcus said. "After everything that happened, after what I did, you saved Sarah Chen's life. You prevented Ethan from killing other children. You made an impossible choice that a 10-year-old shouldn't have had to make." Marcus's expression shifted, relief mixing with something that might have been gratitude. "Dr. Foster said Marina was trying to help you remember who you really were. She died for it. The stress of trying to reveal the truth triggered a heart condition she'd been hiding from me. I'm sorry." She sounded like an extraordinary woman when she contacted me through Dr. Foster. David felt a jolt of electricity. "Marina contacted you about 2 weeks before your honeymoon. She didn't want to approach you directly until she understood the full scope of what had happened to our family. We talked for several hours about your childhood, about the choices grandmother made, about what it might mean for you to learn the truth." "What did you tell her?" Marcus gestured toward a quieter area of the lobby, away from the constant traffic of people navigating legal business. "I told her that you were the kindest, gentlest child I'd ever known, that even after witnessing Ethan's violence, you never showed signs of anger or aggression yourself. I said that if she loved you enough to risk everything to give you back your identity, then you deserved to know who you really were. And if the truth destroyed me, And then at least you would be destroyed as David Wells, not as someone else's ghost. They sat together on a marble bench beneath a window that cast squares of afternoon light across the courthouse floor. David studied his brother's profile, trying to reconcile this composed, professional man with the 10-year-old who'd made a life-or-death decision by a creek in 1985. "I've spent 37 years thinking I was a killer," David said, "living with guilt that belonged to you. And I've spent 37 years watching from a distance, making sure you were safe and happy, knowing that my choice to let Ethan die had cost you your identity. Do you regret it? What you did that day?" Marcus was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the busy flow of people navigating their own legal emergencies and administrative necessities. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that our family was broken in ways that made such violence inevitable. But I don't regret saving Sarah's life, and I don't regret preventing Ethan from killing other children. He would have killed again." Dr. Foster showed me psychological evaluations that were done after previous incidents. Ethan's violence was escalating systematically. Sarah Chen wouldn't have been his last victim. She would have been his first murder in what would likely have become a pattern. David thought about the child he'd been, the 7-year-old who'd frozen when confronted with violence beyond his comprehension. "Why didn't you tell me what you were planning? Why didn't you try to get me away from the creek before?" "Because you were 7 years old, and I was 10, and neither of us should have been making decisions about life and death. I told you to run home, but you wouldn't leave me alone with Ethan. You were trying to protect me the same way I was trying to protect Sarah." The realization carried a strange kind of comfort. David hadn't been a passive witness to tragedy. He'd been a child trying to protect his brother, just as Marcus had been trying to protect a stranger. Their family's capacity for self-sacrifice hadn't been limited to one brother. "The records office is ready for us," Sarah announced, returning with a courthouse employee who looked both important and slightly overwhelmed by the unusual nature of their request. The process of legally resurrecting David Wells took most of the afternoon, involving affidavits from Dr. Foster, testimony from Marcus about the family's history, and careful examination of every document that could establish David's right to exist under his own name. Sarah had brought evidence from the original police investigation, while Marcus provided records from the social services files he'd tried to create in the years after the creek incident. By late afternoon, David Wells officially existed again. He held a new birth certificate, a corrected social security card, and documentation that would allow him to reclaim not just his identity, but his entire sense of self. "What happens now?" he asked Marcus as they stood outside the courthouse in the lengthening shadows of a spring evening. "Now you get to decide who you want to be. You can keep living in Seaside as Marcus Wells, or you can start over as David Wells. You can continue working as a mechanic, or you can try something entirely different. For the first time in your adult life, you have complete freedom to choose your own path." David looked at the official documents in his hands, thinking about the quiet life he'd built in coastal Oregon and the woman who died trying to give him this moment of choice. "I want to bury Marina properly, as David Wells, her husband who loved her enough to finally tell her the truth. She'd like that," Marcus said. "And after that?" "I don't know. I need time to figure out who David Wells is as an adult. I've been Marcus Wells for so long that I'm not sure what parts of my personality belong to me and what parts were borrowed from your identity." Marcus smiled for the first time. Since they'd met in the courthouse lobby, the best parts were always yours, David. The kindness, the gentleness, the way you fix broken things instead of throwing them away, that was never part of Marcus Wells' identity. That was always David. As they prepared to part ways, Marcus returning to his work in Eugene, David driving back to the Oregon coast, to plan Marina's funeral, David felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the possibility of a future, built on truth rather than protective. "Deception. Will you come to the service?" he asked. "Marina would have wanted to meet you. She spent her last weeks trying to understand our family's story. I'd be honored, Marcus replied. It's time our family stopped hiding from each other. The drive back to Seaside took David through familiar countryside that looked different now that he knew who he was driving through it. He was no longer Marcus Wells, the man haunted by memories of a choice he'd never actually made. He was David Wells, the youngest brother who'd survived a family tragedy and spent his adult life building something good from the pieces that remained. The apartment above Murphy's Auto Repair felt like a place that belonged to someone else when he arrived after midnight. Everything was exactly as he'd left it just days earlier, but the man who lived here had been fundamentally changed by the journey to reclaim his own name. David pulled out the photograph of Marina's hands from their wedding day, the one image he'd kept visible throughout their years of separation. For the first time, he understood what he was really looking at. Evidence of a love strong enough to risk everything for the truth, even when that truth might destroy the very foundation of their relationship. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of laying Marina to rest as the man she'd died trying to save. But tonight he would sit with the quiet satisfaction of finally knowing exactly who was grieving her loss and celebrating her courage. David Wells was home. The Forest Service road that led to Marina's final resting place had been widened and improved since David's last visit, but the deeper woods remained untouched by human intervention. Detective Sarah Chen had arranged for the recovery team to meet them at dawn, when the light would be best for the careful work of bringing Marina home after 22 years. David stood at the edge of the natural cave system where his wife had spent her final days, watching as forensic specialists and medical examiners performed their precise, respectful work. The cave was larger than he'd imagined from Sarah's description, a cathedral of stone hidden beneath the forest floor, its walls carved smooth by centuries of patient water. Marina's remains were found exactly where Sarah had said they would be, in a natural alcove that had protected her from the weather and scavenging animals. She'd made a bed of pine needles and arranged her possessions with the same careful attention to composition that had marked her photography. Even in death, Marina had been creating something beautiful. She had supplies for several days, the medical examiner explained to David. Water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit. She was prepared for a longer journey than just getting lost on a short hike. David studied the arrangement of Marina's belongings, trying to understand the final chapter of her story. Her camera bag sat open beside her makeshift bed, empty of film, but containing carefully organized equipment. Her wedding ring, the one they'd found on the car's dashboard, had been replaced by a simple band she'd fashioned from braided wildflowers. Dr. Chen, one of the forensic specialists, called from deeper in the cave. You need to see this. Sarah led David carefully through the narrow passage to where the specialist was examining the cave wall with a high-powered flashlight. Carved into the stone with what looked like a sharp piece of metal were words written in Marina's careful script. David, if you find this, know that I died loving the man you really are, not the ghost you thought you had to be. You were always enough, exactly as you are. Tell Marcus, thank you for becoming someone worthy of Sarah's survival. Tell Sarah thank you for becoming someone who could bring justice to stories like ours. Below the message, Marina had carved a rough map showing the cave's location relative to several landmarks David recognized from their honeymoon. She'd wanted to be found, wanted her final words to reach the people who needed to hear them. She knew, David said, his voice barely audible in the cave's acoustic silence. She knew about all of us, about Marcus, about Sarah, about what really happened that day by the creek. She spent her final days putting together the pieces of your family's story, Sarah said gently. Look at this. She directed David's attention to another section of the cave wall where Marina had scratched out what looked like a family tree. The Wells family as it really existed, not as David's grandmother had reconstructed it, parents at the top, then 3 boys listed in order of age, Ethan, Marcus, David. Below David's name, Marina had drawn a heart and written, "My husband." She figured out everything, David breathed, and she still loved me. More than that, Sarah said, pointing to additional text carved beside the family tree. She understood that your grandmother's deception wasn't malicious. Look, Marina's final message read, "Grandmother Wells loved David enough to sacrifice truth for healing. But love shouldn't require lies, even protective ones. David deserves to know who he saved by being brave enough to love someone like me." The medical examiner approached them carefully, mindful of the emotional weight of the moment. "Mr. Wells, we're ready to move your wife whenever you are. But there's something else we found that you should see." She led them to where Marina's body had been discovered, pointing to a small pile of stones arranged in a careful spiral pattern. She built this in her final hours. It appears to be some kind of memorial or prayer circle. David knelt beside the stone spiral, recognizing the pattern from Marina's photographs of Native American sacred sites they'd visited during their brief marriage. At the center of the arrangement was a piece of tree bark with words carved in Marina's handwriting. "For the boy who saved a stranger and the man who loved me home," the weight of Marina's final gesture, creating a memorial to honor both his childhood courage and his adult capacity for love, broke. Something open in David's chest. For 22 years, he'd carried the guilt of losing her. Now he understood that she'd never been lost at all. She'd been waiting here in this place she'd chosen with deliberate care, ready to tell him the truth about who he'd always been. She had a plan, he said suddenly, the pieces clicking together in his mind. "Even before our honeymoon, Marina had a plan for what to do if the truth about my identity was too much for me to handle." Sarah crouched beside him, studying the stone spiral with professional attention. "What kind of plan?" "She brought the camera to document our conversation about my real identity. But she also scouted this location during our first 2 days. I remember her taking pictures of landmarks, claiming she wanted to capture the geological story of the region." David pointed to the carved map on the cave wall. "If confronting me with the truth triggered some kind of psychological break, if I became dangerous or violent, she had an escape route planned. She knew exactly how to get here from our campsite, but why not just leave? Why stay in this cave for days instead of hiking to safety?" David stood and walked to the cave entrance, looking out at the forest canopy that had sheltered Marina's final vigil. "Because she was waiting for me to remember who I really was. She thought that once the false identity cracked, once David Wells started emerging from underneath Marcus Wells, I'd come looking for her." The realization carried both grief and wonder. Marina had died believing that love could overcome the deepest deceptions, that David would eventually break free from his grandmother's protective lies and find his way back to her. She'd been wrong about his ability to remember, but right about his capacity to eventually seek the truth. "She was trying to save our marriage," David said. "Even after learning that I'd been living under a false identity for decades, even knowing it might kill her. She thought love could survive anything if both people were willing to be honest about who they really were." Sarah stood and moved toward the cave entrance, giving David space to process his final moments with Marina's remains. "The recovery team is ready when you are. Where would you like to take her?" David thought about the question as he stood in the place where Marina had chosen to spend her final days. She died believing in his ability to find his way back to the truth, to reclaim his identity as David Wells, and build a life worthy of the love she'd offered him. "Portland," he said finally. "There's a cemetery near the apartment where we lived as newlyweds. She used to walk there sometimes to photograph the old headstones. She said they told stories about people who'd been forgotten by everyone, except the stones themselves." As the recovery team began the careful process of bringing Marina home, David remained in the cave for a few more minutes, reading and rereading the messages she'd carved into the stone. Her final words weren't the desperate pleas of someone dying alone and afraid. They were the deliberate communications of someone who'd used her last days to ensure that the people she loved would understand the truth about themselves and each other. Marina had died as she'd lived, with her camera nearby and a story to tell. even if she could only tell it through words carved into stone. But this time, the story wasn't about strangers in parks or elderly couples on benches. It was about a family torn apart by violence and lies, and the love that had finally brought them back together when David emerged from the cave. Marcus was waiting by the Forest Service vehicles, having driven down from Eugene to be present for Marina's homecoming. The two brothers stood together as the recovery team completed their work, watching their wives' remains, one lost, one found, being treated with the dignity they deserved. "She would have liked you," David told Marcus. "Marina always said the best photographs captured people as they really were, not as they wanted to be seen. She would have recognized your courage, and I would have recognized her love," Marcus replied. "Anyone who would risk their life to give someone back their true identity understands what love really means." As they prepared to leave the forest, David took one final look at the cave where Marina had spent her last days, waiting for him to find his way back to the truth. He wasn't the same man who'd lost her 22 years ago, and she wasn't the same woman who'd run into these woods, carrying terrible knowledge about her husband's identity, but they were finally who. They'd always been underneath all the deception and protective lies. Two people who'd loved each other enough to risk everything for the truth, even when that truth might destroy them. The riverside cemetery sat on a gentle slope overlooking the Willamette River, its mature oak trees and weathered headstones creating the kind of quiet beauty that Marina had always found irresistible as a photographer. David had chosen a plot near the section where she used to walk, beneath a tree whose branches would provide dappled shade in summer and allow winter light to reach the ground. The service was small but meaningful. Marcus had driven down from Eugene. Dr. Foster had been brought from her assisted living facility, and Sarah Chen stood at attention in her dress uniform, representing both the law enforcement community and the 12-year-old girl whose life had been saved by the Wells family's sacrifice. David had written remarks for the service, but standing beside Marina's casket in the morning light, surrounded by the few people who understood the full complexity of their story, he found himself setting aside his prepared words. "Marina believed the truth was more powerful than comfort," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the cemetery's natural acoustics. "She proved that belief by risking everything to give me back my real identity, even when she knew the attempt might cost her life." He looked at the faces gathered around the grave. Marcus, whose childhood choice had saved Sarah and prevented future murders. Dr. Foster, whose professional wisdom had preserved the evidence that eventually revealed the truth. Sarah, whose survival had given meaning to all the suffering that followed. 22 years ago, Marina disappeared into the forest, carrying terrible knowledge about the man she'd married. But she wasn't running from me. She was running toward a truth she believed could save us both. She died waiting for me to remember who I really was, believing that love could survive even the deepest deceptions. David reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the braided wildflower ring they'd found with Marina's remains. She made this during her final days to replace the wedding ring she'd left on our car's dashboard. I think she wanted to show that our marriage wasn't defined by the false identity I'd been living, but by the choice we'd made to love each other exactly as we were. He placed the wildflower ring on Marina's casket, its simple beauty a stark contrast to the formal flowers arranged around the burial site. "Marina, you gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. You showed me that I was worthy of love as David Wells, not as someone else's ghost. You died believing I would find my way back to the truth, and you were right." Marcus stepped forward, holding a photograph that David recognized from Dr. Foster's files. It showed 3 boys standing by a creek. The image, taken the day before tragedy, transformed their family forever. "Marina asked Dr. Foster to make sure this picture reached you," Marcus said, handing David the photograph. "She said you deserved to know what your family looked like when it was whole, before violence and secrets tore us apart." David studied the photograph through tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. There he was at 7 years old, standing between his brothers with the unconscious trust of a child who believed his family would always protect him. Ethan's mental illness wasn't visible in the image. He looked like any 12-year-old boy, serious but not yet consumed by the darkness that would cost him his life. "She also wanted you to have this," Dr. Foster said, approaching with a manila envelope that bore Marina's handwriting. "She left it with me before your honeymoon, with instructions to give it to you if anything happened to her." Inside the envelope, David found a letter written on Marina's best stationery, the expensive paper she usually saved for special occasions. "My dear David, if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive the revelation of your true identity. Please don't blame yourself for my death. I knew about my heart condition before I decided to marry you, and I chose to risk everything, because love without truth isn't really love at all. By now you know that you're not Marcus Wells. And you're certainly not Ethan Wells, you're David Wells, the youngest brother who witnessed something terrible and spent his life building something beautiful from the pieces that remained. Your grandmother's deception was born of love, but it was wrong to steal your identity to protect you from your own courage. You were 7 years old when you tried to protect Marcus from Ethan's violence. You were too young to understand the choice Marcus had to make, too innocent to carry the weight of what happened by that creek. But you were old enough to love, and that's what you did. You loved your brother enough to stay with him even when staying was dangerous. I want you to know that every day of our marriage, I saw David Wells in your gentle hands and kind heart, the man who fixed broken things instead of throwing them away, who listened to people's stories with genuine interest, who made me feel safe and cherished. That was never Marcus Wells' borrowed identity. That was always you. Build a good life, David. Fall in love again if you can. You have too much love to offer the world to spend it all on my memory. Forgive your grandmother for stealing your name, and forgive Marcus for the choice he had to make. Most importantly, forgive yourself for surviving when so many others in your family didn't. You were always enough exactly as you are." Marina, David folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, understanding that Marina's final gift wasn't just the restoration of his identity, but permission to move forward with his life as the man he'd always been underneath the protective lies. "She's right. You know," Sarah said, speaking for the first time during the service. "You were always enough." The 7-year-old who tried to protect his brother, the young man who fell in love with a photographer, the husband who spent 22 years grieving a wife he thought he'd failed to protect, all of that was David Wells. The kindness, the loyalty, the capacity for love that Marina saw in you, none of that was borrowed from anyone else's identity. Sarah stepped closer to the casket, her voice taking on the formal tone of someone making an official statement. Marina Delacroix Wells died trying to restore justice to a family that had been torn apart by violence and deception. Her investigation uncovered truth that had been buried for decades, and her courage in pursuing that truth saved not just David's identity, but the integrity of the love they shared. She turned to address David directly. "Your wife died believing that honesty could heal even the deepest wounds. As the child whose life was saved by your family's sacrifice, and as the police officer who spent her career seeking justice for victims of violence, I want you to know that Marina's belief was justified. Truth did triumph, even though it took 22 years and cost her life." Dr. Foster approached the casket with the careful steps of someone for whom every movement required deliberate planning. At 91, she represented the longest institutional memory of the Wells family's tragedy, the one professional who'd maintained hope that David would someday reclaim his true identity. "I've spent 60 years working with children who've experienced trauma," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent helping young minds heal from impossible wounds. "In all that time, I've never seen a more complete recovery than David's transformation from a traumatized 7-year-old into the man who stands before us today." She looked directly at David with eyes that had seen him at his most broken and now witnessed his wholeness. "Your grandmother's deception was misguided, but her love for you was absolute. She gave you Marcus's identity because she couldn't bear to watch you carry the guilt of surviving when your brothers didn't. But the man you became, gentle, patient, capable of deep love, that was never Marcus Wells. That was always David. Marcus stepped forward to stand beside his brother, creating a visual echo of the photograph they'd found in their grandmother's storage unit. Two brothers, no longer children, but still connected by bonds that had survived decades of separation and deception. "David, I need to tell you something I should have said 37 years ago," Marcus began, his voice steady but emotional. "When Ethan fell into that creek and I chose not to save him, you didn't understand what was happening. You kept trying to reach for him, trying to pull him out of the water. I had to physically hold you back to prevent you from drowning yourself trying to save a brother who was already dead." David felt the memory surface with sudden clarity, not the false memory of standing by while Ethan drowned, but the true memory of fighting against Marcus's restraining arms. Desperate to save their brother even after Marcus had made the impossible choice to let him die. You were never a killer, David. You were never even a passive witness. You were a 7-year-old who wanted to save everyone, including the brother who would have killed again if you'd succeeded. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Marina asked me to give you this if we ever met again. She bought it before your honeymoon, planning to give it to you when she told you the truth about your identity." Inside the box was a simple gold band, engraved with words that made David's breath catch. "To David Wells. My hero, my husband, my heart." She knew who she was marrying, Marcus continued. Not the ghost of Ethan Wells or the false identity of Marcus Wells, but David Wells, the man who'd survived an impossible childhood and built a life worthy of her love. David slipped the ring onto his finger, feeling its weight as both a memorial to Marina and a commitment to living as the man she died trying to save. For the first time in his adult life, he was wearing jewelry that bore his real name, given by someone who'd loved him for exactly who he was. As the formal service concluded and the small gathering prepared to leave the cemetery, David remained beside Marina's grave for a few additional minutes of private farewell. The Oregon morning was warming into the kind of spring day Marina would have spent outdoors with her camera, capturing the way light moved through new leaves and the patient emergence of wildflowers from winter soil. "I'm going to be all right," he said to the freshly turned earth that covered his wife's casket. "Not just surviving, but actually all right. I'm going to build the life you believed I deserved, and I'm going to do it as David Wells, the man you loved enough to die for." He placed a single white rose on the grave, the same variety Marina had carried in her wedding bouquet 22 years earlier. "Thank you for seeing who I really was, even when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for loving me enough to risk everything for the truth." As David walked away from Marina's grave, he carried with him not just the grief of loss, but the profound satisfaction of knowing that their love story had finally been completed exactly as it was meant to be, with truth, with courage, and with the full knowledge of who they'd both always been underneath all the protective deceptions that had kept them apart. Marina Delacroix Wells was home, and so was David Wells. After 37 years of living someone else's life, he was finally free to discover who he'd always been meant to become. 6 months after Marina's funeral, David Wells stood in the workshop behind his house in Seaside, putting the finishing touches on a restoration project that had consumed his evenings and weekends since returning from Portland. The 1965 Volkswagen Beetle gleamed under the workshop lights, its original sage green paint restored to the cheerful brightness Marina had fallen in love with 22 years earlier. He'd found sage, the real sage, not the moss-covered relic discovered in the forest, in a classified ad posted by Mrs. Patterson's daughter. The retired English teacher had died the previous winter, and her family was selling her possessions, including the car she'd treasured for over 30 years before selling it to a young couple planning their honeymoon. "I remember that car," the daughter had said when David called about the advertisement. "Mother always wondered what happened to those sweet newlyweds who bought it. She said they looked so happy, so ready for adventure. David had driven to Portland that same weekend and purchased sage for exactly what he and Marina had paid in 2003, understanding that some circles are meant to be completed. Now the car sat in his workshop, mechanically perfect and cosmetically restored, waiting for whatever adventure David Wells might choose for his future. The brass bell, attached to his workshop door, chimed, announcing a visitor. Marcus appeared in the doorway, carrying a manila folder and wearing the slightly formal expression of someone bearing important news. "The legal proceedings are finished," Marcus said, settling into the chair David kept for customers who wanted to talk while their cars were being repaired. David Wells officially exists in all government databases. You have a complete paper trail from birth to present, including corrected records of your marriage to Marina. David wiped his hands on a shop rag and accepted the folder containing his new identity documents. Driver's license, social security card, updated birth certificate, all bearing the name he'd finally earned the right to use. More importantly, Marcus continued, the family court approved the trust restructuring. Grandmother's estate, including the house and all her savings, now belonged to David Wells, instead of the fictional Marcus Wells, who inherited them originally. "I don't want the money," David said, the same response he'd given when Marcus first explained their grandmother's financial legacy. "She spent it hiding the truth from me. It doesn't feel right to profit from that deception, which is why I've set up the foundation exactly as you requested. The David Wells Foundation for Children's Trauma Recovery will fund therapy and support services for kids who've experienced family violence. Dr. Foster has agreed to serve on the advisory board, and Sarah is helping establish partnerships with law enforcement agencies." Marcus pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and handed it to David, the Foundation's first project. Sarah identified 12 children in the Portland area who are living with trauma similar to what we experienced. Their therapy will be completely funded, and they'll have access to the kind of long-term support that might have prevented decades of identity confusion for you. The photograph showed a group of children at a summer camp designed specifically for trauma survivors, kids of various ages, playing games and creating art under the supervision of trained counselors. David studied their faces, seeing echoes of his own childhood confusion and hoping that professional intervention might spare them the years of lost identity he'd endured. "There's something else," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "Dr. Foster asked me to give you this." The letter was written in Dr. Foster's careful handwriting, though slightly shakier than David remembered from previous correspondence. "Dear David, I'm writing this from my hospital bed, where I'm spending what are likely my final weeks. Don't worry, I'm 91 years old and I've had a good run, including the satisfaction of seeing you reclaim your true identity before I go. I wanted you to know that your recovery from traumatized child to healthy adult to someone capable of using their pain to help others represents the best possible outcome of everything I've tried to accomplish in my career. You prove that love and professional intervention can heal even the deepest wounds. Your grandmother made serious mistakes in how she tried to protect you, but her love for you was genuine and absolute. I hope you can forgive her choices, even if you can't approve of them. She did what she thought was necessary to save a 7-year-old from carrying impossible guilt. Marina's courage in revealing the truth about your identity represents the highest form of love, the willingness to risk everything to give someone their authentic self. Build a life worthy of her sacrifice, and know that you carry the love of everyone who fought to bring David Wells back into the world. With admiration and affection, Dr. Margaret Foster. David folded the letter carefully and placed it in his workshop's filing cabinet, among the collection of documents and photographs that now told the complete story of his family's tragedy and recovery. "She died yesterday morning," Marcus said gently, "peacefully, surrounded by family and colleagues who'd worked with her for decades. Another person who loved me enough to keep dangerous secrets," David said, feeling the familiar mix of gratitude and loss that had characterized the past 6 months. First grandmother, then Marina, now Dr. Foster. I seem to inspire people to make difficult choices on my behalf. You inspire people to love you, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Love sometimes requires difficult choices, but that's not the same as inspiring them. David looked around his workshop, at the tools and equipment that had provided structure and purpose for his adult life. Fixing broken things had always come naturally to him, whether they were engines or people or relationships damaged by time and neglect. But now he understood that his gift for repair had grown from his own experience of being broken and carefully mended. I've been thinking about selling the auto shop, he said. Using the proceeds to expand the foundation's reach, maybe move to Portland to be closer to the work. And the house? The life you've built here in Seaside? David gestured toward Sage, gleaming under the workshop lights like a promise of adventures yet to be taken. The life I built here was based on hiding from the truth. David Wells deserves the chance to build something new, something authentic. What about companionship? Marina's last letter encouraged you to fall in love again, maybe someday. But first, I need to learn who David Wells is as a complete person, not as someone carrying borrowed guilt or hidden trauma. I spent 37 years being the wrong person. I want to spend some time being the right person before I ask anyone else to love me. Marcus stood to leave, but paused at the workshop door. For what it's worth, I think Marina chose well. The man you've become, kind, thoughtful, capable of using his pain to help others, that's exactly who a 7-year-old David Wells was meant to grow into. After Marcus left, David returned to his work on Sage, polishing chrome and adjusting mechanical tolerances with the methodical patience that had always brought him peace. But tonight the work felt different, not like maintenance of something old and worn, but like preparation for something new and full of possibility. The brass bell chimed again, and Sarah Chen entered the workshop wearing civilian clothes and carrying a bottle of wine. I heard the legal proceedings were finalized. Thought we might celebrate David Wells's official existence. They sat in lawn chairs beside Sage, sharing the wine and watching the sun set over the Pacific through the workshop's open doors. The ocean had always provided David with a sense of perspective during difficult times. Its endless rhythm a reminder that some things endure no matter how dramatically human lives change. I have news, Sarah said. The Portland Police Department offered me a position heading their new Family Violence Prevention Unit. I'll be working directly with children who've experienced trauma, using what I learned from my own recovery to help them avoid the kind of identity confusion you endured. You're leaving the state police? I'm moving toward work that feels more personally meaningful. 37 years after a 10-year-old boy saved my life by making an impossible choice, I want to make sure other children have better options than violence or secrets. David raised his wineglass in a toast. To better options for everyone. To Marina's courage, and to David Wells finally getting the chance to discover who he was always meant to become. As darkness settled over the Oregon coast, David felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the complete absence of secrets or guilt or borrowed identity. He was exactly who he was supposed to be, in exactly the place he was supposed to be, surrounded by people who knew his complete story and loved him anyway. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of building a new life as David Wells, using the foundation of truth that Marina had died to give him. But tonight, he would sit beside the restored Volkswagen that had carried his young marriage toward tragedy and transformation, grateful for the love that had finally brought him home to himself. Some love stories end with happily ever after. Others end with the hard-won knowledge that truth is more valuable than comfort, and that being authentic is more important than being safe. David Wells had learned the difference, and he was finally ready to live it.